glad to be here. So I'll be talking about Alexey Navalny's presidential campaign in 2017. I'm going to argue that it is significant for post-Soviet politics in more general ways. And I have much to say about it that I'm going to cut out of this presentation, but I'm happy to get into more detail in the Q&A. So I'm going to make 3 points on why I think this was a significant event for post-Soviet politics, of course, post-Soviet Russian recent history. These 3 arguments are, if this doesn't fail me, first, the specific use of technology that the campaign used. Everybody's using social media, obviously, but this was a specific combination of platforms and an integration into offline campaign work that made it stand out, I think. The second is the campaign's approach to the regions. So this was the first time that a political challenger, especially from the liberal spectrum, was taking the whole of Russia seriously, and not only in addressing demands that were coming from the regions, but also in trying to harness the potential that is in the regions in terms of people and resources. And third, it's the take on the programmatic, on the framing and the work on the program. So before going into these 3 points, I want to make a quick reminder of who Navalny actually is. Right? He's a lawyer by training, and that helped him in his anti-corruption activity that he's been rolling out since the 2000s. He's a shareholder of large state companies like Rosneft and Gazprom, so he has access to internal documents of these companies, and that is the basis of many of his anti-corruption investigations that he's been conducting. He's also been a political activist since the 2000s. He started in the party Yabloko, and in parallel, he was developing a nationalist profile, and that was what got him expelled from Yabloko in 2007. So I call it the heavy flirting with nationalism, because I'm not really quite sure how serious that is, but I get into those programmatic details later on. But he was always claiming to be on the liberal side of the nationalism, but he used really harsh rhetorics in regard to people from the Northern Caucasus and from Central Asia. And this got him into fights with his liberal colleagues pretty often. But he said this is a problem. Illegal immigration, more broadly, is a problem we have to address, and I'm the person doing it. And that got him into trouble various times, and he toned down the nationalist rhetoric for his later, larger campaigns, but it's still in there, I think, and we'll get to that later on. So in the protest of 2011-12, he became a very important figure, a protest leader, and after that he sort of established himself as the most important political challenger, non-systemic political challenger. So essentially not being allowed to take part in elections and still trying to change political reality. Hi, welcome. So the data that I'm going to base my points on is a selection of data and 2 sets of original data that I've collected myself. One is a set of 23 semi-structured interviews that I took with 4 activists of the campaign in the regional network of campaign offices. So I traveled through Yekaterinburg, Perm, Saratov, Samara, Krasnodar, Rostov, Volgograd, and talked to people in the campaign offices who were really paid to do the work. So these were the people who were closest as possible to the campaign. The second set of data is an online survey that I conducted with 2 colleagues, with Andrei Semyonov and Elena Sirokina. And this is an online survey that we planted in the social media groups of the campaign. So the campaign set up Contact groups across the regions, and we approached subscribers to these groups with invitations to take part in the survey. And that was conducted on the peak of the campaign in early 2018. So this sample we got of about 1,200 respondents is not representative of the whole of Navalny's supporters, obviously, because the selection strategy selects for the more online, the younger audience. But since this audience is an important subset of the whole support base, I think, and this is a significant data, I think, to talk about the campaign as a whole. So those are the two data sets that I'll be referring to over this talk. All right, to clear the path towards these three broader claims I'm going to make, I'm now going through the basic socio-demographic indicators that come out of this online survey. Here's the age distribution. It's you can see it's a pretty young sample. Median age is 23, but I would argue it's not as young as it was made to be in the press. So it was called a movement of high school students, like Navalny Shkolniki. And these are really students, most of them, right? So it's 60% are between 18 and 29 years old, and only 18% are below 18 years. And this is actually representative of the contactive group. So we sampled this stratified by age and gender. So this represents the contactive groups. As I said, it might be a younger audience overall, but it's a pretty accurate picture of the social media supporters. In terms of gender balance, where is that? Oh, here we go. It's pretty male dominated, and this is not an artifact of males being more likely to answer the survey, but it comes directly from the contacted groups and the profiles and how people identify in their profiles rather than answer the survey. So this should be rather accurate of the distribution. Third, socioeconomic status. This is a very standard instrument that's used by Levada a lot. It's a 6-point scale where people rate their living standards. From 1 being we can't afford basically nothing, to 6 being we can afford basically anything. And we'd like to compare that to the distribution in the general population. So we took a Levada poll that has the same question, but we restricted that comparative sample to urban internet users to make a meaningful comparison. So this is people who are using the internet more than 5 times a week and who live in large cities, to be able to compare it to our sample. And you see, average-wise, it's pretty similar. So that the mean is pretty similar between these two groups. It's 3.5 in our sample and 3.6 in the comparison sample. But our sample is broader, so we have larger standard deviation, and we have more people at the margins. That's why it looks different, right? But the average is pretty similar. Finally, education. This is the same comparative sample of the general population. Higher education completed or at least started is 80% in our sample and about 50% in the comparison sample of urban internet users, as I call them. So this is a pretty young, very well educated, rather well off but not super rich, male dominated movement, if I can extrapolate from the data. So these are very rough, broad strokes, but just to give you a sense of what this database is composed of. Okay, maybe I just take a sip to let that sink in, and then start with the first point. Okay, so concerning the first point I want to make, the use of technology. So there are 2 sub-points here. One is the use of social media to distribute the message of the campaign in an environment that's highly restricted, right? Navalny doesn't have access to television, and there's much of counter-campaigning against him conducted in the government-friendly media. So social media is really the only place to get the message out at all. But then it's also, of course, a way to organize the campaign, to solve coordination problems inside the campaign, and to escape surveillance and repression, by doing it in a smart way. So concerning the first point, this is, of course, what everybody knows. One of the most important single outputs of this campaign is this 45-minute YouTube film about corruption allegations against Prime Minister Medvedev, arguing that he uses a very elaborate system of charitable foundations to embezzle state funds. And as classic Navalny work is, this is the drone pictures of this huge palaces that allegedly are owned by Medvedev through this very complex set of ownership relations. And so this is this is not just a political message, but it is a very entertaining thing to watch. And that's why it was so effective, I think. So this is very well technically produced. It is a very, you can sit back, relax, and just watch it as a movie. At the same time, it has a very focused, very easy to understand, very personalized political message. Right? It just says this guy, Medvedev, is using taxpayer money to finance his lifestyle, and we should do something about it. And I'm Navalny, I'm the one who can do something about it. And this turned out to have a large mobilizational effect. This is a quote from an interview with a person whom I met in Yekaterinburg, who's a core activist. He's 21 years old. He was never actively involved in politics before. He just stumbled upon this video. He got hooked on it, as he says. Then he went to the protest event that was then conducted a few weeks later. And he went on his own. No peers had seen this video or were interested in that. So he went on his own, but it was a transformative experience for him nevertheless, because he met others whom he liked and who invited him to the regional office, which was just being opened, and he was becoming an activist right away. So this was really from 0 to 100 in a few weeks, and a very effective mobilization story that was triggered by this online medium video. And to see whether this was sort of an outlier or more of a general pattern, we asked the people in the online survey, how did you get interested in Navalny's campaign? What triggered you to this, to find this interesting, right? To sort of get at the question whether this was more of a remobilization of an existing follower base or whether it was a mobilization of new followers. And this is what we got. So there was a subset of these people who said they were already interested in Navalny's actions. It is a significant part, but it's a minority. And the most important, this is the first bar here, 35% saying it was actually the video that made them interested. And then there's other, smaller factors, unspecific blog, YouTube publications during the campaign, other things like street agitation, I was invited by a friend, all of these things. But the first and most important trigger was really the video. So that's sort of to support the first point of this interaction of offline protesting and the online mobilizing that really got people into the movement. The second is the use of technology for organizing the campaign. So there's good work on that by Alexey Navalny of Westminster University in London. It's not yet published, but it's going to be published soon, I hope, who looked at Telegram as the major communication channel of the campaign. So it's a very elaborate network of Telegram channels in the regions for the volunteers to communicate with each other, but also for the central headquarters to communicate downwards to the regions to give instructions of how the campaign should be conducted in the regions. And Telegram was used because they trusted this more than any other social media, including Facebook and WhatsApp. Not just Contacte, but also the other Western media. And then there's another important aspect of it, which is that they did much of their own programming. So for example, there was this event, they call it Hackathon, in August 2017, where they invited people from their own regional network, which was established by them already. And they said, okay, we have some coordination problems which we would like to solve with new technological innovations. Please send us your ideas. And then they selected and invited their own staff to Moscow, and they put them in a large room, gave them a set of computers and 63 liters of Red Bull, and had them, work out these new little apps and whatever. And like, for example, for coordinating electoral observers in the regions, and all of these little technical advances that they could really benefit from in their own campaign. So that was, one, it was really effectively harnessing resources that existed, like the programming skills that they had among their activists, but it was also sending a message about merit-based selection, I think. So this was also a political statement that they were making, that in contrast to the society and the state that they were criticizing, which is, in part based on patronage, they were sort of recruiting people by merit and by their actual abilities. And this was a prefigurative element, I think, that they stressed very much. So they wanted to be an example of the government that they would at some point going to be. But then, of course, this creates tensions later on that I'm coming to later. So the second point. I'm taking a sip again. Second point is the approach to the region. And really the fusing of the existing resources in terms of people and also in terms of experienced activists, and integrating that with a bunch of newcomers and creating something new from that. This is a map of the protest events conducted on March 26th, 2017. So this was 3 weeks after the release of the On va du monde video, and they were having protest events across Russia to demand that Medvedev respond to the challenge. And then they had another round of protests on 12th June, which are happening in even more cities. And this was, I think, strategically quite well played, and also a lesson learned from the For Fair Elections protests that had happened 6 years earlier. Because when you bring newcomers to the street, it sometimes happens that they get really, really agitated and want to do something more permanently. And here, handily, they had a set of regional offices in place that people could just go to and engage with without having to be really experienced activists. So they were then taking part in a very structured campaign. They could just take a task on and do it without having to think about much, how do we frame it, how do I get on with that? But they just took a task and did it. And so so the combination of these protests, mobilizing new people, and the set of regional offices in place was really important to harness the potential of the newcomers. But then there's also the grassroots activists that this campaign attracted. And this is a very important part. So there are very different pathways into the campaign for these grassroots activists. I'm just singling out two ideal types here. The first is the liberals who were involved with Navalny's projects or other liberal political projects like Parnas, or Navalny's Moscow campaign in 2013, or the Democratic Coalition in Kostroma, or in 2016 on the federal level. And then for them, the Navalny's campaign was really just a logical next step. Then there was the others who came from everywhere. This is an example of a guy from Krasnodar who had been involved in ecological activism, had gone to left-wing groups in his town, had a brief Yabloko episode. It was really all over the place. And for him, this was also a logical connection, but more of a temporal alliance rather than being there because he supported Navalny. Right? He told me that he's not exactly a fan of Navalny's, and there are even things that he doesn't like. But he figured that political competition has been destroyed by the regime to an extent that this is now the place to be if you want to be active in politics, whatever the disagreements might be. And there was another one in Perm who said pretty much the same thing. He was a housing activist, and he said Navalny is all wrong about housing, but I forgive him, and I forgive him everything policy-wise because the campaign overall is so important. So this is an important subset that this campaign attracted and really fused with its own structure. And again, to see how this plays out overall in the online survey, here is a subset of respondents who claim that they were actively engaged in the campaign. So not just online supporters, but they were doing something on the street, like handing out flyers, etc. And so they're organized by intensity of engagement. Right? So these are the people who claim to be active every day. It's a very small fraction. And then it decreases in intensity several times per week, several times per month, one time per month or less. And you see two important things here. One is there is a newcomer majority, so the light gray is the newcomers without any prior activist experience. There's a majority of newcomers, but there's a significant proportion of those who have some kind of previous experience. And the share of those who have experience increases as intensity of engagement increases. Right? So having these experienced activists on board became more and more important the more involved people were. So, and that replicates in the interviews that the core activists, really most of them had some previous activist experience. So, with this combination of newcomers and seasoned activists, they built up this network of regional offices. This is a map that the campaign put out itself. On the height of the campaign, 81 offices opened. And so the procedure of opening these offices was very top-down, very hierarchical. People could send in their CVs to the federal headquarters. They were reviewed, and then people were invited for interviews to Moscow, and then they were selected or not. So this was really a selection procedure that isn't so social movement-like. It's more, like large corporations or administrations do human resources. And then these offices were kept up by financing from the federal headquarters, which was collected by crowdfunding and then dispersed to the regions. So again, a very top-down approach. And this was noticed by the activists on the ground because there's obviously a tension between using the potential on the ground there and really working with the local activists, but still directing them from the top down into the direction that the campaign wanted them to go. So there's this tension between the grassroots and the top-down approach, and this one activist phrased it very well. I think he said, "I don't like the process of organizing the campaign. Everything depends on the leader. Everything is very personalized. I would even say authoritarian." And then he says the local coordinator has no direct connection with Navalny, only with intermediaries. So it's a real power vertical, right? To use a common metaphor. And then he said even every social media post in the local Kontakte group had to be approved on some higher level. And he then connects that to a demand that the campaign made itself, which is trust the regions, don't decide everything in Moscow. Right? And he spotted the contradiction there, and he complained about that. But to be fair, most activists I interviewed saw this contradiction, but most also agreed that this was necessary. So they were saying we are operating in a very hostile environment. Strategies are shifting, and sometimes have to shift very quickly. If we would debate everything on the ground, we couldn't do this campaign. So whether this was kind of a post hoc rationalization of them, or whether they were really thinking that, I don't know. But most of them agreed with how it worked. And this kind of complaint is in my interviews, it is, is an exception. Right. And finally, the third chapter on program and framing. And I think when the program of the campaign was rolled out, and it was rolled out pretty late in the campaign, so they had this 6 theses and no real program at all. So what was Navalny actually going to do if he becomes president? It was not really clear, and in that it already showed that this wasn't really a political campaign in the sense that he wanted to become president. But when the program was finally rolled out, it was clear that it was designed to accommodate very different sets of political orientations. And the way to do it was to implement these demands into the master frame of anti-corruption activity. And I think it worked quite well. So here are several demands from the campaign, and you can see how they try to address different sections of the electorate. So here's the classical liberals with the demand to abolish taxes for small entrepreneurs and to reduce the bureaucratic apparatus. Here's the nationalists, right? Remember, Navalny is coming from a nationalist platform, and this is what stayed in the program from this time. So this idea that there needs to be a visa regime with Central Asia and the Southern Caucasus. And here's the center-left part of the electorate, raising the minimum wage drastically from 10,000 to 25,000 rubles a month, and increasing state investment in social sector, like health, housing, and education. And implementing, well, you know, it's kind of difficult to square all these things, and the way they try to do it was through the anti-corruption thing. So the major demand, like opening criminal cases against officials whose lifestyle doesn't seem to resonate with their salary. And I think this anti-corruption master frame is not just a reflection of Navalny's personal history as an activist, but it's also a good strategic choice, because it can be, you can argue against corruption from very different angles, ideology-wise. So I just give you two examples from the interview. There's this, for example, this libertarian perspective, where this guy essentially argues that corruption is a function of obstacles created by the state. So the rules are just too many, and in the wrong places, that people naturally tend to circumvent them by corruption. So it's really a problem of too much state regulation. Whereas there's, of course, the other perspective that puts the emphasis on the redistribution side of the corruption and the equality of outcome. And this guy says corruption is bad because the public sector is affected by it, and we can redistribute our taxpayer money when it's stolen before. So these are, I mean, these perspectives can be squared with each other, I think, but they target different points, and they really reflect different underlying ideological positions, I think. So the corruption master frame, I think, is a good vehicle to accommodate a very diverse set of political orientations, and I think that is necessary to do in the current environment. Right. So I think I've opened a lot of boxes that we can talk about in greater detail, but I'll stop here and just summarize the three major points. So again, the specific use of technology, not only for distributing the message and mobilizing, but also for solving coordination problems in a very hostile environment, media-wise, but also repression and surveillance-wise. The second point, integrating the regions, harnessing the potential that is there, but integrating that into a new structure that is actually being kept up. We can talk about all of that, what came out of those regional offices. Some of them are kept open and are still working. We can go into that later. So integrating that into a new structure, and the strategic framing, accommodating a variety of ideological positions through the master frame of anti-corruption activity. Right. That's it for now. Looking forward to questions. Yeah.
So, can I start? Do you mind?
Oh, yes, of course.
So, I'm really fascinated with the regional strategy of which protests get approved and which don't.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you thought about that, and also whether or not the campaign itself has better connections with regional officials, and if there's some negotiation that's happening that works, or... what you thought about it.
So let me go back to this one. I didn't address that, but there, as you can see, there's a difference, right? So the red dots here are those events that are not approved by authorities, and there are fewer red dots in this later picture. This is actually interesting. I haven't come across in the interviews answers to this question you have. So why is it that authorities apparently changed strategy here?
June 12th is constitution day in Russia, I think.
Sorry?
Maybe it's like June 12th is constitution day in Russia. Maybe it's related.
It may be. It may actually be. Yes. And the important thing is it changed back. So these are two pretty early events, but then in October and November they were holding another series of demonstrations where none of those applications were approved. So it was really going back to this picture, more or less. And I think they gathered a lot of experience in dealing with the local authorities through that, because they sent out really dozens of applications, for different times, different days, and figuring out how to do it. But I don't really know about the strategy on the authorities side, unfortunately.
It is, I mean, you have two types of variation. You have the variation over time and then the variation across regions
Sure.
within the single event. And it's interesting to see that change.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have some questions. Much of what you said, of course, is not familiar to me, so I'm coming from a perspective of not knowing many things, not knowing much about it. But how was the film disseminated beyond just being put on YouTube? Because there needs to be some strategy to get people to watch it. So, yeah, what was done to do that? That was one question I was thinking. The other one was, I know you are talking specifically about the people that you could track through online means. So you ended up with perhaps a group that is representative of just that. But what do you know about the people that you could not track, and what do we know about participation of other age groups or people who would not be that active online? And that probably would include women as well for a number of reasons. I don't know whether you have other means to kind of tell us a little bit more about those people.
Okay, the first question, so it was placed on very different social media channels. Not only Navalny himself, but also his campaign workers, the central strategists, Leonid Volkov, and the press secretary, Kira Yarmush, and all of the others. They all have their Twitter accounts, their Facebook accounts, etc. So it was kind of, they tried to reproduce it that way, and then it got some media attention, right? Not from the large television stations, but having crossed a certain threshold in attention, then oppositional media picked up on it, and that then set in motion, the next stage of this becoming a viral thing, and then it spread through decentrally spread through the network. So I think they were making a gamble with that, because they have other films that are equally well produced, like the movie about Yuki Chaka a little earlier in 2015 is pretty much the same style, and also others. And this one worked pretty well, and there was also an element of luck in that, I think. So it's probably unfair to backward engineer this as a mastermind operation that worked out exactly as planned, although it probably wasn't a large element of that. But there was probably also an element of luck that it spiraled so much.
Or it sprung some kind of, it produced some kind of a resonance in the audiences.
And on other supporters, well, that's very difficult, right? Because the interviews I did were with the core activists, and in terms of age and gender profile, that was a bit different. Although it's a very low number, so I can't really say that's representative at all. But there were at least older people there, and so if you take the median age of this small interview sample, it's about 35 or something. So there were really some older activists involved in the local core activist groups. That I can say with some level of certainty. But even those people were obviously connected on social media as well, so they would be part of the sample too. But unfortunately, I can't say anything about people who weren't part of that sample. It's likely that there is a group of people who aren't yet on Contacte who would support Navalny, but I can't say how likely it is.
What does, if you look at those protests, is there any sense of an older age group being present in larger numbers or not, even if you cannot quantify it specifically?
Yeah. Well, the protests were broader than the set of Navalny supporters, because they were just events like a little bit like the fourth fair elections protests. They weren't just people who were demonstrating against the falsifications at the election. There were also people bringing their own concerns from the local struggles to those demonstrations. It was a little bit like that in this protest wave as well. So there were people from different ideological camps, using this as a platform for their own demands. But unfortunately, there's no, at least that I know of, no systematic investigation into that.
From my experience, that's a lot of women. Actually, that's a high number of women engaged.
I'm sorry?
From my experience, from the work that I've done, it's not a lot of women who protest, but it's a lot of people, women in the organizations. So it's actually fairly high, even in the democratic groups. And there's a couple of Scandinavian scholars that have some good data on this. That women are, what kind of jobs did women have? Did you ask them about their jobs?
Well, I asked the core activists.
Right.
Well, those who were young were either students or, or
No, I mean in the campaign, or did they have positions of responsibility in the campaign, or?
We didn't have that. I
Yeah.
didn't have that question. Later we realized we should have asked more questions, but this was already like 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So unfortunately we don't have that, I think. Yeah.
You mentioned that Navalny is a shareholder of Rosneft and Gazprom. Is there any discussion within the organization of a threat of cutting off his access to internal documents? Because it's actually surprising that it hasn't already happened, right? If he's a threat by revealing all these things, it's effectively state law. You might expect that they would just cut off his access. So is there any concern from the organization about losing this access, or is it just something that's
I haven't heard about that. I mean, it's a fair point. I think the reason now maybe that this is not so important anymore to him is that he has opened up other sources for information. So he was starting out with this, and now he's also accessing like just publicly accessible documents. It's just more on the internet than you would think there is, like ownership of land and all of that. But also, I think he has some sources in the authorities who sometimes send him documents. Because he's effective at targeting. He's effectively making the system a little bit better by opening up its weak spots. So so he always claims that he has brought millions and millions of rubles back to the Russian taxpayer by exposing these corrupt schemes, and some of them were then ended or closed. Right? So that's actually in some way it's beneficial for the regime, and also it's also beneficial, I think, because it's really pointing the regime to its weak spots more generally. So Navalny doesn't really have a chance at the moment, I think, to really become a real threat. He's as close as you can get to a threat, but I don't think he's a real one. But he's a good training, a good sparring partner for Putin to work on his strategy to combat opposition.
So can you comment, I mean, some people have tried to map out who his targets are in some of those, exposures and tried to draw conclusions about who he's not attacking, and whether it's just an informal source or protection from someone in the regime. Do you have thoughts about that?
It's obviously it's very difficult to get real data about that. I mean, there are these speculations that he's being used in these fights between different agencies, like FSB exposing the National Guard because they don't like the National Guard, and then Navalny's making a movie about it, like Zolotov, and then that creates problems for that specific agency. But that's unfortunately all I can say. I don't, and if that's true, the question is whether that makes Navalny any less of a genuine challenger, right? So he would still use any opportunity he could get to hit the regime overall. And if that targets one agency a little bit more than the other, he would probably not really care, as long as it makes a general message. That's probably his perspective, and trying to exploit it as good as possible. But he's probably aware that there will be some people trying to use it.
Yeah, so I like very much like the graph with the paths to activism. Like some people stay, some come from other places. And I wanted to ask if you have any information or insights about what's different between the people that stay, like Charles Bolotny and mayoral campaign and then presidential, and the people that defect that may not stay. The reason why I ask is you also did a bunch of interviews with Navalny people in 2017 for government projects. And one of the people I talked with was Vitaly Srukanov, who was the deputy of Nikolai Raskov in the Moscow headquarters, who just a few months after this defected and took the party Progress brand with him, so now it's stole basically. And also a few other activists that since left Navalny and publishing smear and compromise about him, and especially the dynamic in the Moscow campaign. There was also the story around Maxim Katz. So I kind of wonder the defection away from protest movements, what defines the core, the loyalists or the people that come and go.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I've been thinking about that as well. It's very difficult to get these people to talk to you. We wanted to do that in the online survey, so we had a second round, because 600 of those 1,200 actually left us their email address, so that we could come to them another time. And then this would have allowed us to really see who stayed on and who dropped out. But it wasn't, unfortunately, successful because there was only 50 people replying to them, and it's just too low a number, I think, unfortunately. So this is the problem you run into, right? Those who defect are also those who are no longer interested in talking about it. So and some may be very agitated about something, and they would want to talk to you, of course, about what went wrong in the campaign. But finding these is very difficult, and I haven't yet had the time and resources to do that. So anything I would say on that, who are the loyalists and who are the defectors, would be speculation, and I think there's much of biography involved too. Right? So people, for example, there's this one activist in Rostov. She wasn't involved in the Navalny campaign, but I interviewed her, and she was very active and very putting herself out and being ready to be arrested and threatened. But as soon as she had a child, she completely dropped out because that was a new situation for her. And these situations just happen, and they have nothing to do with the dynamics of the movement, but with the biographical changes, and that needs to be considered as well. And then, of course, there are these tensions, like personal problems and fights, like in the Moscow headquarters that happen. So I really struggle to make a systematic answer. So, but that's a topic I want to engage with in the future.
I do, just to observe, when we did some similar work in the Moscow mayoral campaign, we had a lot of people saying the same things about, don't really like Navalny,
Yeah.
I'm not here for Navalny, but there are so few ways to express dissent or express support, that I think that it's hard to predict who would come out again based on what you just said.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
so it may be that if Navalny's still the only game in town, they'll come out again,
Yeah.
which is,
That's right.
I think, what we're starting to see in the accumulation of people. It's interesting.
And of course, now the strategy is to keep people involved, because now because they offer to them a more local-based kind of activism. So these 80 offices that I showed you on the map, 40 of them are still open, and now the way they work is they propose projects to Leonid Volkov, who directs the regional part of the campaign, and they either give them money or they don't. So they pitch their projects, what they want to do on a local level, like investigate this bureaucrat for corruption, or do this investigation in an environmental pollution thing, or whatever it may be, and then they maybe finance for their project, and then they do it. And that is probably something that keeps people in the movement, because it's more closely connected to their everyday lives. They have the chance to really get engaged in their own city. But this network, of course, is being kept in place to use it for the next national level mobilization, and to agitate, for example, for the smart voting campaign that Navalny conducted a few weeks ago. So this is, again, the attempt to connect the civil society, the local level activism, with the larger political questions, and also organization-wise. And yeah.
This is not only this was not only a well-organized campaign, but had to be well-financed campaign. Where did the money come from?
So what they're saying is crowdfunding. Crowdfunding, right? But they don't reveal who is part of the crowd. So, of course, there are. I mean, it's. I think it's conceivable that they are largely existing on rather small sums. So they have, like, their average sum is something like between 1,000 and 5,000 rubles, but average is not a really good measure there, right? I mean, there can be just a few very large and many very small donations, and still the large donations would be what's driving the overall sum, and the average would be somewhere in the middle. But so the median would be more important here, but they're giving the average. So they're a bit secretive about it, and from their perspective it makes a lot of sense, because as soon as you publish the names of the donors get problems. Especially if they're business people who think this is an important project to support, because they promise at least to secure property rights and reintroduce the rule of law and all of that, which is generally beneficial for business. But if they reveal their names, these guys will lose their business first hand, right? So it makes sense to be secretive about it, but it's also frustrating for researchers who really have to deal with very few information. So there were rumors that Khodorkovsky is involved, although publicly he's not really a fan of Navalny's. Right? They're keep fighting in the public, but there might be his money. But I still think that large parts of the financing is really coming from crowdfunding. And that is what the activists also tell me. right? That they have connections to local businesses and they're contributing, not huge, but you know, sums of money that are not individually driving the campaign, but that accumulate. And Leonid Volkov, who is the strategic director of the campaign, is an activist from Yekaterinburg originally. He was a local deputy. He was a programmer and manager at an IT company, and he has developed very good relations with local businesses in Yekaterinburg to fund his local campaign at the time, at the end of the 2000s. And he's really a very open and talkative guy who likes to make connections to very different kinds of people and mobilizing small and mid-sized companies to contributing. I think that is probably also large.
Can you talk about what's happened recently? I think you hinted you might have some things to say about sort of what the local elections and the protests around that earlier this year. And it also seems like the pressure just continues to ratchet up, and
It is.
they're
Yes.
trying to seize money on their accounts now and designate them as new foreign agents. So
Yeah.
just thoughts on where things are now.
Yeah, so, I mean, the authorities see that this is a working model that they kind of have to grapple with. It's not working, as I said, it's not working in the sense that it's a direct challenge to power at the moment, but it's a great training ground for Navalny's future activities. So he's learning a lot doing this, and they want to disrupt this learning process by just cutting him off from the regional network and just destroying the regional network. And they're now, the repression campaigns are much more coordinated across the country than they used to be. This is, again, as I said, this is sort of this interaction between the campaign and the regime. When I did interviews with activists on the forfeited elections protest, they were revealing that repression is very different across the regions. So there were regions like Perm and Yekaterinburg where there were essentially very good working relations with the FSB and the police. So they could do their protests. They weren't really repressed so much. There was some, okay, they took political candidates off the ballots, etc., right? So this manipulation was happening, but not so much repression, whereas other regions like Pskov was really heavy. And the Navalny campaign, I think, is an important moment where this starts to equalize, and it equalizes, obviously, in the direction of high repression. So now Perm and Yekaterinburg get a lot more repression than they used to. And now people in Yekaterinburg in the Navalny campaign are targeted as much as they are targeted in Pskov. And also their relatives are getting searches from the Secret Service. And they're really trying to threaten people on the ground from, refraining from connecting to the campaign. Freezing their personal bank accounts, for example, which is, existential problem for many. So it's pretty terrifying to see it, right? But usually they are aware that these things can happen. I ask them in the interviews, are you prepared for the, repercussions that this might actually happen? They say yes. So I probably won't get a job in the state sector anymore from this point forward, unless Navalny is president. And I'm prepared to do it, but it's tough. And it's now it's already tough on their surroundings, on their neighbors, on their relatives. And the question is, how long can they keep it up? All right.
All right. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your.
Thank you. This was a great
Yeah.
conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you.